Scooby-Doo, where are you? We got some work to do now. Scooby-Doo, where are you? We need some help from you now. Come on, Scooby-Doo, I see you. Pretending you got silver. You're not here with me, 'cause I can't see the way you shake and shiver. You know we got a mystery to solve, so Scooby-Doo, be ready for your act. Don't hold back. And Scooby-Doo, if you come through, you're gonna have yourself a Scooby snack. That's a fact. Scooby-Doo, here are you. You're ready and you're willing. We can count on you, Scooby-Doo. I know you'll catch that feeling.
Hello again, my meddling Scooby Doo fans, and welcome to another review into the world of Scooby Doo. So last time, I continued my Scooby Doo book review series with a review of issue number 5 of the Scooby Doo Wario Gold Key comic series. I hope you guys enjoyed that. We talked about how one adaptation was terrible and the other one was below average, but essentially both were inferior, watered-down adaptations due to the fact that the gang was pretty weak, there was a lack of suspects, there wasn't really a mystery, and there wasn't really any atmosphere. But of course today, I'll be covering issue number 6 of the Scooby Doo Wario Gold Key comic series, titled The Ghost of Redbeard and Hand from the Wall, which was released in June of 1971. It's not specified when in June of 1971 it was released, but that's the month and time frame it was released in. The short synopsis of the first story is, the gang tried to solve the case of the return of Redbeard the Pirate, who's making all of C.L. Magnus's shipping freighters disappear. And the short synopsis of the second story is, when the Mystery Machine runs out of gas, Scooby and Shaggy look for help at a house with many spooky special effects. So this is my 6th book review in terms of the mainline series of Gold Key comics, but the 7th overall, as I've also covered the first of 3 March of Comics stories. So, yeah, essentially, this is a series where I'm tackling Scooby-Doo's book history from beginning to end, and this is an area of Scooby-Doo that's not really talked about a lot, so that's what the purpose of this series is, to kind of get people more familiar with the books, but also just a fun journey for myself and others who maybe haven't experienced these comic books. Now, these early comic books are more so adaptations of episodes, specifically Scooby-Doo, Where Are You? But as time goes along, we'll get more original stories, and the stories will probably be a lot more interesting and entertaining. And thankfully, for this comic book, we do have an original story. We have one adaptation and one original story. Now, the availability of this comic book is alright. Like, it's kind of pretty highly priced. Not too bad, but it definitely is not rare, but I would say you definitely are going to get your money's worth if you pay for this comic book. This comic book is on the higher side. It's a little bit higher than the previous comic books. Kind of on the scale of issue 2, but not as rare, I would say, as that comic book. So just be prepared that if you do buy this comic book, it is going to be a little bit of a hefty price. I should also mention that this comic book was re-released as issue number 26 of the same Scooby-Doo Wario Gold Key comic series. So when I do get to issue, when I do get to that point for issue 26, I won't be re-reviewing this comic book. I'm just going to consider this both a review of issue 6 as well as 26. So expect, if you're wondering like why down the line issue number 26 will be skipped over, that's essentially the reason why. Is that essentially it's just the 2 same stories, but they were reissued later on. They were basically resold and put out again. Now, despite the rarity of the issue 6 version of the comic book compared to the issue 26 version, which aren't really that different, like I said, it's just the covers, I was able to get my hands on the original issue 6 version. It's really only just a color change, I believe, on the cover page. Everything else is the same, but I did want the issue 6 version because I wanted the original version rather than the resold, rebranded version Not that it makes much difference. I mean, you could get the issue 26 version, it would still be the same stories. It would just be a cover color change. A color change on the cover page, essentially. But I got it right here. So, without further ado, here is my issue 6 version of Scooby Doo Where Are You Gold Key comic series. Look at that beauty. I believe this is the pink one. I don't know what the other color is. I forget what color they changed it to, but this is the issue 6 version. So, yeah, there you go. Now, as far as this book's reception is concerned, I'm not really sure how fans feel about this particular comic book. This is a comic book that has one adaptation and one original story. So, the adaptation is of Redbeard's episode, which essentially is Go Away Ghost Ship. It is an adaptation of the episode Go Away Ghost Ship, which is Season 1, Episode 14 of Scooby Doo Where Are You? I do have a review of that particular episode, so if you're interested in my thoughts on that particular episode, you can go find it on my Scooby Doo Where Are You review playlist. I believe I said in the original review that I considered that episode to be average or mid-tier, which is about right for these comic books, because a lot of them either sway towards decent to terrible. But the original story, completely different experience. This is a wholly new original story. I have no idea what I'm going into. But if history is anything to go by, the previous 2 new stories, per se, weren't exactly very promising. So, yeah, as far when it came to my expectations for this comic book, I went in with, like, decent to low expectations, because most adaptations seem to be either decent or bad, and the original stories don't usually hit that beat. They haven't really hit that, good beat yet. They've mostly been either terrible or below average, so I'm hoping this one will break the mold. But it is good to have an original story alongside an adaptation, so at least I have something new to kind of cover. But with that being said, and me sharing my thoughts on the original episode, and saying that it was average and mid-tier, while also not being experienced with this original story, what do I think of issue number 6 of the Scooby Doo Where Are You Gold Key comic series? Do I think it is a good and underrated comic book? Do I think it is another terrible comic book? Or is it a decent, average, mid-tier comic book? Well, let's find out, shall we? So let's take a look at this comic book to see whether I think it is a good or bad Scooby Doo book. The book begins with the gang enjoying a meal when a news bulletin interrupts their broadcast, announcing that the ghost of the pirate Redbeard has raided yet another freighter. Curious and concerned, Mystery Inc. decides to investigate. They visit shipping magnate C.L. Magnus, whose vessels are the only ones being targeted. After a tense encounter with his creepy butler and a failed attempt to get inside, the gang sneaks their way into Magnus's penthouse, where he explains the legend of Redbeard and his vow of revenge. By the way, I just gotta say, I find it interesting that they change up how the gang get inside the hotel, because Fred says that he has previous knowledge of C.L. Magnus's penthouse due to him having a job, I guess, as a delivery boy, which is kind of interesting, an interesting change. It doesn't really hurt the story overall, and it's not a bad change, to be quite honest, because instead of the gang kind of breaking into the hotel and his penthouse without any prior knowledge, at least this time Fred has some prior knowledge, but it doesn't get him past their butler, so they still have to do the same thing they did in the episode. Determined to help, the gang heads to the docks that night to catch the ghost ship in the act. Using a decoy plan with a taped foghorn, they lure the mysterious fog bank toward them, only for the real ghost ship to appear and nearly ram their boat. Their motor fails, forcing them to paddle frantically before the ship slices their boat in half. They climb aboard the pirate vessel, where Shaggy and Scooby stumble into Redbeard's crew, get forced into cooking Coast Pirate stew, and narrowly escape through slapstick chaos. Meanwhile, Fred, Daphne, and Velma explore the ship's hold, uncovering clues like dry ice used to create the eerie fog and the absence of any real ghost pirates. I also gotta say, Velma makes this funny, dramatic scene of she thinks she's gonna die or something. I don't know, I guess because of the dry ice, she thinks it's like maybe some gas or something. But it's so funny because she, like, faints over and she's like, oh, I'm gonna die, tell my parents that I love them or something like that. And it's so out of character for Velma, and it actually doesn't happen in the episode. But it's really funny when I read it, and it's actually a pretty funny moment for Velma, and actually was pretty entertaining to read. Shaggy and Scooby discover a hidden cove, a skull-shaped grotto, and a ship's manifest dated for the next day, proof that the pirates knew cargo details before the ships even sailed. Following tire tracks deeper into the cave, they uncovered a warehouse full of stolen goods. Now, unlike in the episode where Shaggy and Scooby reunite with the gang, and they follow the tire tracks to the treasure chest with the skull, with the microphone, and they use certain pirate slogans and sayings to open the passageway. And Shaggy says liverwurst in the episode, and it works. But in the book, Scooby just says his name, Scooby Doo, or something to that effect, and it works then. And I don't like this change. I feel like it's very contrived. I know the liverwurst thing was kind of contrived a little bit in the episode, but at least it makes more sense because they did have liverwurst in the crates, so it's not unreasonable that they would have that as a password. Whereas in the episode, I mean, yeah, you could argue they had Scooby snacks in the crates as well, so Scooby could have been a password, but I highly doubt it. I think the liverwurst was more plausible as a password than Scooby-Doo's name himself. I think that was kind of a stretch. The gang reunites just as the pirates attack, but they turn the tables using barrels, tires, and silk to subdue the crooks. The final twist reveals that C.L. Magnus himself was behind the hijackings, using the ghost legend to cover up his scheme to steal his own cargo and pay off his gambling debts. Which is actually really different from the episode. As the episode, it's basically an insurance, based motive, whereas in the book, it is to pay off his gambling debts. However, I actually like this motive change. It's not a bad change for a motive, and it's not too far off from C.L. Magnus's previous motive in the episode. It's a bit weird that they would change it up, but I still think it works, and I'll explain why when I get into the outro. An insurance agent arrives to take him into custody, and Velma explains that the ghostly fog was nothing more than dry ice dumped into the water. Also interesting is that this insurance agent actually ends up being C.L. Magnus's creepy butler, which was not in the episode. The butler was a suspect, but he was not an insurance agent. So instead of having the Coast Guard come and him being the final one to arrest C.L. Magnus and his crew, it ends up being C.L. Magnus's butler, who was a suspect, just like in the episode, but he ends up being an insurance agent. So it's not unlike Scooby-Doo episodes where you have suspects who act suspicious, but they end up being just agents that were going undercover to foil the villain's plan, and the gang help them out. So it's not unfeasible for that change to happen because it's happened in Scooby-Doo since then. So I don't mind the change. It actually isn't that bad because it makes C.L. Magnus's butler way more interesting than him just being a random creepy butler. It actually makes him way more interesting that he's an insurance agent who was just kind of spying on C.L. Magnus. So that's not a too bad of a change itself. I think this is the first comic book adaptation where the changes don't really bother me, other than the liverwurst password change to the Scooby-Doo password change. Most of the changes have been fairly good and not that bad. And the first story ends with Scooby-Doo proudly reenacting the pirate mystery on the dock, surrounded by vapor, before delivering his classic Scooby-Doo to close the adventure. The second story begins with the mystery machine sputtering to a stop on a lonely road, leaving the gang stranded without any gas. Fred sends Shaggy and Scooby to find a station, but their detour leads them into a strange old house where nothing behaves normally. What's so funny about this is that Fred sends out Shaggy and Scooby, and because Fred asks them for an extra gas can because they ran out of gas. And Shaggy says that he used it on his bike or motorcycle, which honestly was very interesting because I think that implies that it's the same motorcycle or bike that Shaggy borrowed from Charlie in Decoy for a Dog Napper, and that he used again in Don't Fool with the Phantom. I like to think that's the bike that Shaggy's talking about, especially since it is an adaptation of Scooby Doo, Where Are You? Although this is an original story, and we're covering the original story, but I like to think that because it's in the same series as these comic book adaptations, that's probably the bike Shaggy's referring to. And just look at Fred's face when he hears that Shaggy used his extra tank of gas to fill up his bike. He is so pissed off, and that is so fucking funny. When I saw that face, it was hilarious. It rivals what Velma did in the previous story with her overdramatic, saying, "Oh, I'm gonna die, tell my family." Fred, with his fucking face, he's just so over it, and I don't blame him for sending Shaggy and Scooby out, because Shaggy did not give any heads up that he was using this gas canister, this extra gas can, for his bike, and didn't tell Fred that, and Fred is rightfully pissed off, and that fucking face is hilarious. I love it. Moving staircases, talking statues, grabbing chairs, and treadmill rugs turn their simple errand into a full-blown haunted obstacle course. As Shaggy and Scooby try to escape the bizarre house, a ghostly hand suddenly reaches out of the wall and grabs Shaggy, prompting frantic cries for help. Outside, Fred, Daphne, and Velma hear the commotion and rush inside, convinced their friends are in danger. When they finally track down the source of the mysterious hand, they discover the truth. An elderly man hiding behind an elastic wall covering, using trick props and spooky gags. He explains that he once ran a spook house at Fun Park and, bored in retirement, recreated the same scares in his home for fun. Feeling guilty for frightening them, he offers the gang free passes to the amusement park. The story wraps up with everyone enjoying the rides at Fun Park, laughing at the night's scares. And the book ends with Scooby-Doo happily shouting his signature Scooby-Doo catchphrase as the gang enjoys the harmless thrills of the park. I'm going to give the first story of issue number 6 of the Scooby-Doo Warrior Gold Key comics series 3 stars out of 5. And I'm going to give the second story of issue number 6 of the Scooby-Doo Warrior Gold Key comics series 1 star out of 5. So yeah, we have another disappointing comic book issue. It continues the trend of the original stories. The original stories still have yet to be anything good. All of them seem to be bad. And it's because they're really not focusing on creating original mysteries, but they're more so just like trying to, I don't know, feel like time wasters. I'm really hoping that eventually the original stories will be more focused on mysteries, because that seems to be not that much of a focus in the original stories that they've done so far, which is why a lot of them so far have been kind of lackluster. And the adaptation of Go Away Ghost Ship, I will say, is probably the best adaptation I've seen of a Scooby-Doo Wario episode so far. Most adaptations are watered down, and while I still would say the episode is better overall, I do commend the adaptation for at least making some changes that weren't as bad as previous comic book issues. The changes made in this one were actually not that bad. Most of them were pretty good and preferable, but I would still say that the episode overall is the more preferable option. I still think the Scooby-Doo Wario episode is the definitive version of that story. But I will say the comic book offers a nice variety to that story if you're looking for it. Or if you want something similar to that story and you like that episode, but you want something a little bit different. The changes aren't that bad to me personally. So, yeah, kind of a mix of decent and terrible. So, before I get into the positives of the first story, because I'm going to be going into the adaptation of Go Away Ghost Ship first, and why this adaptation is decent and not as bad as many of the other adaptations, I'll first get into the negatives of the first story of the adaptation of Go Away Ghost Ship, and talk about the stuff that kind of holds it back from being a really good or great adaptation of the episode. So starting with the negatives for the first story of issue number 6 of the Scooby-Doo Wario Gold Key comic series, I found Daphne to be weak in the first story. Daphne didn't really do anything major in this particular comic book adaptation of Go Away Ghost Ship. She didn't really find any major clues, wasn't a leader, didn't help piece together the clues to help solve the mystery, wasn't cowardly or comedic. She was just kind of there and didn't really have much of a presence or was noteworthy at all throughout the comic book adaptation of Go Away Ghost Ship. Then we have the villain of the first story, who I thought was weak as well. So, of course, the main villain of the first story is Redbeard the pirate, the same as in the episode. Now, I think in my original episode review, I said Redbeard wasn't as strong, and I think I might have been a little bit too harsh, because I actually do really enjoy Redbeard in that episode, and I've come to appreciate him more. I don't know if I said that in the original review. It's been a long time since I made that original review, but I think I didn't give Redbeard the proper credit he deserves. Because in the episode, Redbeard's really fun and entertaining, and he actually has a great screen time and presence. In this comic book adaptation, though, I don't find Redbeard to be scary or, creepy or intimidating at all. A lot of that has to do with the fact that he just doesn't have that fun presence like he does in the episode. And, yeah, he punches Shaggy in the eye, which is very surprising. I don't know why he punched Shaggy in the eye for no reason. It was different in the episode where Scooby, kind of was, mocking his portrait, like he was basically touching it up with his marker and being funny, and Redbeard didn't punch him. Even the Redbeard in the episode threatened to kill Shaggy and Scooby by saying it better be good, or like that, basically implying that he's going to kill them. But in the comic book adaptation, it's not the same, he doesn't do the same thing like that. I don't think he even does that motion in the comic book. So he's not as intimidating and threatening as he is, because he's definitely someone who has more of a presence and screen time in it. And I also don't find him to be fun or entertaining, because he doesn't really exude that presence that he has in the episode. Redbeard's like a maniacal, laughing, funny pirate villain, and he relishes in his villainy. He is a fucking amazing villain. He's a joy to watch. He's got one of those contagious laughs, but also just a warm, a very compelling screen presence that I don't think is really captured in the comic book. And I think because he's not really prominently featured too heavily, he has a lack of presence and screen time in this comic book adaptation that I don't feel like he does in the episode. In the episode, it feels like he really takes over the scenes. And I feel like in the comic book adaptation, they don't give him a whole lot to work with. He doesn't really have that presence and that screen time that he did in the episode. And his henchmen get it even worse, because his henchmen are completely non-existent and absent in this comic book adaptation. They're there, but they're only seen in glimpses, like 1 or 2 pages, and they're not as prominent as they were in the episode. In fact, Redbeard's crew was actually more prominent in the episode than it is in this comic book adaptation. But yeah, to me, Redbeard also wasn't great either, because I didn't like his redesign. I found it to be odd and weird, and I don't think it fit the Redbeard character. I think Redbeard has an iconic design, and I don't see the need to really tinker it or change it up. I really don't know why the comic book felt the need to change Redbeard's getup, because Redbeard looked great in the episode, and I feel like they should have just kept with what worked. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. And for some reason, they tried to fix something that wasn't broken in the first place. Redbeard's design was great. They did not need to change it, but for some reason it did, and I just didn't like it. So yeah, to me, Redbeard is completely weak. He is not as strong as he is in the episode. The episode, he's more fun and entertaining. He's a little bit threatening and intimidating, but due to his, threatening Shaggy and Scooby to basically kill them if they don't, do what he says. And he just has more of a presence and screen time, and he relishes in his villainy in the episode, whereas I think in the comic book, they don't really capture Redbeard's persona in that, in the episode. I feel like this is an inferior version of Redbeard, and his henchmen are completely non-existent, so they're not even worth talking about, and they're not as, a vital part of the story as they are in the episode. I feel like they have more screen time and presence and are just as important as Redbeard in the episode, whereas in the comic book, it's like they didn't even try. They might as well have just written out him having henchmen, and it would have been the same scenario. So yeah, I really wasn't huge on Redbeard in this comic book adaptation. I much prefer him in the episode. I think he's better in the episode. Next, I found there to be no mystery in this first story. So I don't really get the sense that there's much of a mystery, and I don't know if I said that in the episode review, but in this comic book adaptation, I feel there's no mystery because we know why Redbeard is going after CL Magnus. Like, we know his backstory, we know why he's after CL Magnus, and there's not really a mystery there that's engaging. The gang pretty much get the answers that they're looking for when CL Magnus tells the story of his ancestor and Redbeard the pirate and why Redbeard is targeting his shipping line. So I feel like there's not a mystery there, or there's no real lingering questions that I want answered throughout the comic book. And yeah, I don't know if I felt the same way in the episode because it's been a while since I've watched that episode in my original review. But I don't feel like there's a sense of mystery in this comic book adaptation, and I don't feel like there's any lingering questions that I want answered because I get the backstory of Redbeard and I get what he's going after. So I feel like there's not really a sense of mystery prevalent throughout this comic book adaptation. I found there to be no atmosphere in the story. I felt no tension or suspense or creepiness or eeriness from either the main villain of the story or the setting. It really wasn't as prevalent as it was in the episode. I think the episode did a better job with atmosphere. It had that foggy, spooky vibe that was prevalent in the episode. And while there is a bit of fog in the comic book, I don't think it's really as prevalent as it is in the episode. Now, I get it. Comic books have a real tough job. Episodes and movies and video games have an easier time making atmosphere because they have music, they have visuals, they have sound cues, they have a lot to help them create atmosphere. Comic books rely solely on visuals. If the visuals don't sell me on the atmosphere of the story, I'm not really going to feel it. So it really depends on visuals, and there's not that heavy lifting that other elements are prevalent in for TV shows, episodes, or movies, or video games. So I know it's hard for a comic book to create atmosphere, but I still feel it's fair to at least judge atmosphere because it is a vital aspect to Scooby Doo and the formula and what I'm looking for. And it's not that there isn't potential to have atmosphere. It's just how you do. It's really just based on the visuals. Like, can you do the visuals right enough to where I feel the atmosphere of the story? And to me, I just don't feel it. I don't really fear for the gang's safety throughout this comic book adaptation. I wasn't on the edge of my seat wondering what's going to happen next. I didn't find anything creepy or eerie about the main villain of the story or the setting of the story. I just felt there wasn't really sense of atmosphere that there was in the episode. I know they tried to create that with fog, but I think the fog wasn't really as prevalent as it was in the episode, and I don't think it did it effectively as well as the episode did. I think that it fell short, basically, of it, and the visuals just were not good enough to really sell me on the atmosphere. Like I said, atmosphere is, it's not impossible to get in a comic book. It relies more on visuals, and comic books have more of a tough task because books have to provide that visuals rather than the additions of music and sound cues and as well as visuals. They have more to work with, which I feel that comic books really don't have. But at the same time, there is potential to have atmosphere, and it can be done. It just solely relies on how you do the visuals well. And to me, the visuals did not do enough to really convey any sort of atmosphere. So for me, I didn't really get a sense of atmosphere in this story. And my final negative is I found the setting of the story to be kind of dull, in all honesty. It's really just a ship and a cove that's the main setting of the comic book, which doesn't really feel very fresh and unique. And it feels kind of more generic. We've had a ship as a Scooby-Doo setting before up to this point. In fact, in issue number 2 of the Scooby-Doo Wario Golki comic series, we did have a ship as a setting. And a cove isn't really that interesting. In fact, I don't even think they refer to the island as Skull Island in this comic book adaptation. They just say it looks skull-like or skullish, but they don't actually refer to it as Skull Island. And the ship isn't as I guess, explored enough. I mean, the ship has more of a presence, and it has more cool set pieces in the episode that I don't think are really, prevalent in the comic book. I think the comic book kind of really doesn't spend a whole lot of time on the ship, and it's not really as effective for me. I just think the setting is a little too generic for my tastes. We've had ships and coves before. It's not really that fresh and unique. It doesn't do enough to really make it stand out in any way, and it just kind of feels like very dull settings to me personally. I'm not really invested in the settings. They're just like, whatever settings. Like, we've had this stuff before. Not really anything interesting here. But that's all I got for negatives for this first story. So now let's go on to the positives of the first story and explain what makes this story decent, in my opinion. So starting with the positives for the first story, my first one is that I think Fred was a good leader in this first story. I felt like he told everyone where they needed to go and what to do next. I felt like he drove the story. I felt like he was a natural leader in this comic book adaptation. I also feel like he did a good job helping capture the villain at the end. Yes, him, Daphne, and Velma were tied up, unlike in the episode, and Shaggy and Scooby did a lot of the heavy lifting, but he did help out a little bit at the end by using those oil barrels, I believe, to trip him over. Shaggy and Scooby obviously did most of the heavy lifting, like I said, but Fred did help out a little bit by knocking over one of the barrels. So I feel like he did good improvisation, essentially. He didn't create a cool trap in this particular comic book adaptation, and he wasn't as, I guess, effective because as he was in the episode, because him, Daphne, and Velma did help take down his henchman in the episode, which wasn't in the comic book adaptation, which is a shame. But yeah, I think overall Fred did fulfill his basic leadership role, and I did feel like he did enough to help, capture the villain at the end, along with Shaggy and Scooby. Then we have Velma. Velma was actually kind of funny in this comic book adaptation. I actually found her to be a bit funny in the story, and it was really only for one bit when they were in the room, like I said, with the dry ice, and she thought she was gonna like die or something. It was completely out of character for Velma, but I really liked it because it went on for like a page or two, and it was pretty funny and out of nowhere, but it gave me a chuckle and a laugh, and it at least made Velma stand out in some way. It was surprising to say the least, but I did like Velma's sense of humor in this comic book adaptation. And to be fair, her and Daphne did have a funny exchange in the episode. They had one small humorous exchange in the episode. It was not in this comic book adaptation, but Velma did carry over some humor in this comic book adaptation, like she did in the episode with that small bit of humor, although it wasn't as exaggerated and over the top as it is in the comic book. But yeah, while Velma didn't really fulfill her basic role of being, helping to piece together the clues to help solve the mystery or really being a leader, I think that bit where she was kind of funny was enough for me to give her a pass, because she at least stood out in some way. She was at least entertaining somewhat, which is not something that usually is the case for Velma. And last, but certainly not least, we have Shaggy and Scooby. Shaggy and Scooby help find the major clue of the story, which was the ship's manifest, and they help capture the villain at the end. Although Shaggy, I would say, did most of the heavy lifting, Scooby definitely did help out a little bit. But Shaggy was definitely the driving force. But yeah, both of them did a really good job. They weren't their usual funny, cowardly selves. I don't think they had a lot of humor going for them in this comic book adaptation. And they weren't necessarily that cowardly as in the episode. I think in the episode they had a lot more funny lines, and they were actually way more humorous and cowardly in the episode compared to the comic book adaptation. But they did help find the major clue of the episode that is in this comic book. And they did help capture Redbeard at the end, just like in the episode. So I feel like Shaggy and Scooby did enough to, at least have some notoriety in some way. They weren't, useless or, felt like background characters. They actually did something noteworthy and something of note, and were actually prevalent in the story, just like in the episode. So yeah, I did think Shaggy and Scooby were good, even if they didn't fulfill their basic roles, kind of similar to Velma. Outside of costume, I found CL Magnus to actually be pretty good. I mean, he was in the episode too. He provides the backstory of Redbeard the pirate, you know, the villain of the episode, his alter ego, and I like that he kind of plays victim. CL Magnus is just as good as he was in the episode. I like that he sets up the villain, gives the whole backstory, not just for himself, why he's, you know, the target, but, you know, why Redbeard's after him, and he sets up his alter ego well, and I like that he kind of plays victim a little bit. He's like, oh, woe me, I'm being targeted, when in reality, it's just like an act. Like, and it's all an act, so... Yeah, CL Magnus does stand out and is actually pretty good because he does help provide some useful backstory to Redbeard the pirate, which is good. There were a good number of suspects in this first story. So you had 2 suspects in this story, just like in the episode. You had CL Magnus's butler and you had CL Magnus himself. Now, in the episode, I don't think I gave this a pass because Redbeard had his crew, and there were 3 villains total. There was Redbeard himself and his 2 henchmen. The reason I give it a pass here is because the 2 henchmen are not prevalent enough for me to consider them villains. In fact, they're barely even there. They might as well have not even been in this comic book adaptation. That's how useless they were. They did nothing of note in the comic book. So for me, I think, unlike in the episode, I am willing to give it a pass because Redbeard is really the main focus when it comes to the villain department. I don't really feel like his crew, his 2 henchmen, are that prevalent enough to be considered villains and to be considered part of the suspect pool. So, in terms of, you know, the comic book and what it did, and mainly focusing on Redbeard rather than Redbeard and his crew as a whole, it did make the suspect pool at least good because 2 suspects, 1 villain, I feel like is good. It gives you a 50-50 chance on who it could be. And yeah, I think the suspect department was done pretty well. I think it was done better than it was in the episode because it focused less on the henchmen, unlike in the episode. But that does have its set of drawbacks as well. So it's kind of a toss-up where some things are done better due to these changes, but other things are not. Then we have the motive of the first story, which I thought was good as well. So CL Magnus's main motive is that essentially he wanted to scare everyone away so that he could hijack his own ships and pay off his gambling debts. Now, this is different from in the episode, because in the episode, he's basically stealing cargo and selling it and running like because his company is going down, and it's basically more insurance related. He's basically trying to make, he's getting money from both angles. He's stealing from his own ship and, profiting off of that, but also getting insurance as well. So he's getting money both ways, and it's kind of like an insurance scam, but also he's stealing his cargo to, basically help, keep his company afloat. In this one, he's not keeping his company afloat, he's paying off gambling debts, which is an interesting change, a very interesting change, but not a bad one. Not a bad one. In fact, it rivals the original motive, in fact, for me. I think it's a good motive. And the reason I find it good is because it's something different and unique, but it's actually good. It actually doesn't hurt CL Magnus's character, because I could see CL Magnus in another version of the story doing this exact thing, paying off his gambling debts. And gambling debts are not something a Scooby Doo villain usually does. That's not usually a motive that's very prevalent, especially at this point in the franchise. That was definitely very new. And while new motives on their own and unique ones aren't necessarily going to make it good, I feel like there's enough layers to it to where I find it interesting, because I did find the layers of the original motive to be great. I found the ways he was making money both ways was actually pretty smart. And he was a little bit more sympathetic, I would say, in the episode, whereas I think in the comic book, he's less so sympathetic, because he kind of put himself in this own situation. But I will say, it's still engaging and still interesting. I like that I don't mind the change, because, it doesn't hurt that his motive is different from in the episode. I think the original motive is probably the stronger of the two, because it makes CL Magnus more compelling and interesting and makes him look pretty smart. But I will say this motive is actually a nice change of pace, and I like that we have a gambling debt-focused motive, which is, again, not something we've had before. And having the butler be an undercover, like, insurance agent was also something pretty interesting. Although I will say it would have probably fit better in the episode than it did in this comic book. But I will say it's not a bad change at the very least. So yeah, I like the motive. I don't think it hurts that they changed the motive from the episode. I think the changes were, just as good as in the episode. Are they better than the episode's motive? I don't think so. I think the episode's motive still is better because I think, like I said, CL Magnus is a little bit more sympathetic, and I think that the ways he was making money was definitely way more engaging than I think in this one. But I think this motive is just as good, and I think it's a suitable and fine enough replacement to the original motive. And my final positive for the first story of this particular comic book issue is I found the clues of the first story to be good as well. So there's really only one clue in this comic book adaptation, and that's the ship's manifest, just like in the episode. The ship's manifest is a good clue because it helps point towards a motive, just like in the episode. I feel like it's a good, vital clue. I don't think it helps narrow down the list of suspects because both the Butler and CL Magnus are pretty tied to CL Magnus's, shipping line. So it doesn't really, kind of narrow it down because really it could be either or. But it does help point towards a motive. And it does obviously tell you that the person behind the costume, whether it be the Butler or CL Magnus, was someone that was familiar with the shipping line if they had this manifest in their possession. So yeah, I think the clue was good because it helped fulfill its basic role, which was to help point towards a motive. So that's all I got for positives and negatives for story number 1. Let's get on to the second story of issue number 6, the original story. So starting with the positives for the second story of issue number 6, I actually found Fred to be pretty funny in this particular story. I found him funny because, like in the comic book, like I said in the review section, I love how annoyed and pissed he was at Shaggy and Scooby for using his extra gas, canister for his bike and not telling him. And the face he made was pretty funny. I thought it was pretty funny how annoyed he got, and he sent them on their merry way to go find gas for them because Shaggy was the one that kind of got them in the situation. And yeah, it was just one comic book panel, maybe 2, but still, I think it was enough to give me a chuckle and a laugh, and enough to where I can give Fred a pass in the story, because other than that, he doesn't really do a whole lot. But I found Fred to be pretty funny in that moment. I actually did like that, those 2 pages where he was kind of annoyed at Shaggy and Scooby, particularly Shaggy, for taking his extra gas canister and using it for his bike without telling him beforehand. Then we have Scooby. I thought Scooby was good as well. I like Scooby in this, original story, the second story, because he helped save Shaggy from the villain a good number of times in the story. And you guys know I'm a sucker for whenever Shaggy and Scooby save each other, or when they save Fred, Daphne, Velma, or Fred, Daphne, Velma saves them. I'm always a sucker when any member of the gang saves each other, especially Shaggy and Scooby when they save each other, because they're best buds and they'll do anything and stick by each other's side. And even when they're cowardly and are scared of, the threat that's at hand, if their best buddy is in danger, they will put aside their fears to go save their best pal, which I love. I always am a sucker for that, and it always, touches me. I always love when Shaggy and Scooby do that. So yeah, I love that Scooby, helped Shaggy and didn't leave him behind and helped him out any way he could whenever the hand from the wall or these other props would fucking, try to grab Shaggy. But that's all I got for positives for the second story of issue number 6. So let's get on to the negatives of the second story and talk about why this original second story is terrible, in my opinion. So starting with the negatives, my first one is that I found Daphne, Velma, and Shaggy to be weak in the story. Daphne didn't really do anything of note. She didn't find any major clues. didn't help piece together the clues to help solve the mystery, wasn't a leader, wasn't cowardly or comedic. She was really not there that much, just like Fred and Velma were not there that much in the story. Same thing with Velma. Velma didn't really help piece together the clues to help solve the mystery and didn't fulfill her basic role or was really a leader. She also wasn't very prevalent in the story. She was kind of in the mystery machine with Fred and Daphne for a good chunk of the story. And Shaggy just didn't really do anything noteworthy. He wasn't his usual funny, cowardly self. He didn't really have much humor. I mean, sure, you could say it's a little funny that he used the gas canister without telling Fred. But I think that's more humor on Fred's part because of Fred's reaction to that, news, and not so much Shaggy delivering that news. And also because I'm kind of on Fred's side this time. Like, that's not usually a thing I would say. I'm always on Shaggy's side, but this time, like, Shaggy kind of screwed up. Like, that was all on him. He should have told Fred that he was filling up that bike. But I do like that nod, and thinking that maybe that Shaggy's bike is the same one that he borrowed from Charlie in Decoy for a Dog Napper and presumably kept, as we saw in Don't Fool with a Phantom as well. So, yeah, I just didn't feel like Daphne, Velma, and Shaggy really did anything of note. Daphne and Velma really because they didn't fulfill their basic roles and because they kind of were absent for a good chunk of the story. And Shaggy because even though he was in the story for the majority of it, he didn't really do much to really stand out and wasn't really noteworthy for me personally. So next we have the villain of the second story, who I thought was weak as well. So the main villain of the second story is the titular Hand from the Wall, just like the title of the story suggests. The hand from the wall is not scary or entertaining. It's just a regular ass fucking hand. The idea and concept of a hand coming out of the wall is creepy, but it's not really executed that well. The hand from the wall is not scary. He doesn't do anything threatening or intimidating or scary or creepy or eerie, but it's not fun or entertaining. Like, the hand doesn't really have, like, a presence or screen time to it. It just kind of comes out of nowhere and tries to grab them, but you're not really sure what the hand's intentions are. It could just be some dude trying to fuck around with them, and it ends up being some dude who's just bored and just wants to fuck around with them, which, yeah, I mean, that's doesn't really make the hand from the wall that, compelling of a villain, because it's just a dude putting his hand through, his hand through the wall to basically just to entertain himself because he's bored. So, yeah, the hand from the wall really isn't that great of a villain. It's kind of like whatever. Like, this hand doesn't really have any sort of presence or screen time to it. It doesn't really stand out anyway. It's not scary or entertaining. Outside of costume, I found the unnamed retired Carnival Spook House operator to be pretty uninteresting. The operator, the retired Carnival Spook House operator, who we don't get the name of, he's just this dude, and he's just this old man who's just kind of bored with his life and doesn't really set up anything. He doesn't set up the backstory of the villain because it's just his hand coming out of the wall. And while he does spill out his reasoning for why he did what he did, that's more so emotive and not really context. And he doesn't really appear beforehand until the gang find him behind the wall and find out who's behind there. We don't even know the guy's name. He's just like an average Joe. He's just a normal dude who's just bored with his retirement and just trying to look for some fun and misses his job, I guess. So he's not really an engaging character because we don't really know much about him, and we don't know why he's bored or, what kind of person he was leading up to, that experience. He wasn't really that prevalent in the story until after they figured out that he was the man that put his hand behind the wall and was the titular Hand from the Wall villain. There were also no suspects in the second story. Shaggy, Scooby, as well as the rest of the gang, encountered no sort of suspects at all. There was no suspect pool at all before they met this unnamed guy. They did not, see anybody beforehand. It was literally just Shaggy and Scooby go to find a gas, some extra gas for the mystery machine. They stopped to take a break because I guess they were, exhausted for some reason. I'm not sure how far they walked from the Mystery Machine. It couldn't have been that far because Fred, Daphne, and Velma came not too far away from them. But then again, Fred, Daphne, and Velma walked up, were walking as well. So who knows how far they were from the Mystery Machine? Maybe they were far, maybe they weren't. I don't know. But yeah, they were walking to, I guess, presumably a gas station to get some extra gas for the Mystery Machine. And we're just sitting down, to kind of take a breather before they go and do it. And just unfortunately happened to be a victim of this old man who was too bored with his retirement, so just decided to fuck around with them and spook them. And then Shaggy and Scooby end up getting, free tickets at the end, which is nice of the man. But yeah, there was no sort of suspect pool there. Like, they didn't meet anybody before they saw the old man in the house. They met no sort of person whatsoever. It was completely devoid of any suspect pool, so we have no one to guess on who this hand from the wall could be because we don't see anybody before that point. And when we do get the answer of who it is, we don't even know who that guy is. I found the motive of the second story to be dull as well. So the main motive for the unnamed retired carnival spook house operator is that essentially he wanted to scare everyone away for his own amusement because he was bored of retirement. So like I said, he basically just wanted to scare people because he was bored and just wanted to have fun in his retirement. And because being a spook house operator was all he knew, he figured being scary was what would give him joy. At least Shaggy, Scooby, and the rest of the gang got tickets at the end for that, that endeavor. But yeah, I do feel bad that poor Shaggy and Scooby had to endure that, not knowing that it was fake. But yeah, the motive, I mean, you could say it's unique and interesting. I don't think it is. I think it's kind of a dull motive because there's not really much context to it. We don't really know much about the guy. And while it is kind of interesting and unique that, he's doing it because he's bored of his retirement and just wants to scare people for the fun of it, I think the lack of context to this guy kind of makes it so the motive isn't as interesting as it could be. Maybe if we knew more about this guy, maybe the motive could have been more interesting. But as it stands, I just don't think there's enough layers to the motive for me to consider it interesting enough for me personally. I think it was too dull for my taste. I found there to be no mystery in the second story as well. I didn't really have any sort of lingering questions that I wanted answered. There was no sort of prevalent mystery throughout the second story. It was kind of, like I said, just Shaggy and Scooby going for gas. And unfortunately, and while taking a breath, happening upon an old man who was bored of retirement and just wanted to fuck around with them. So there wasn't really a sense of mystery, I feel like. There was no lingering questions about the house or the villain or, anything at all. I didn't really feel there was any sort of mystery at all that was prevalent in the story. There were also no clues in the second story. Fred, Daphne, Velma, Shaggy, and Scooby found no sort of clues whatsoever throughout the second story. There were none that helped them point towards a motive or narrow down the list of suspects. They basically just found the guy behind a wall because Fred, Daphne, Velma came in, helped Shaggy and Scooby out, and then realized, where the guy was hiding, and found him out pretty quickly. Like, there was no clues, narrowing down a list of suspects because there wasn't any, or helping point towards a motive, mainly because it wasn't really the focus of the story. So yeah, there was no sort of clues whatsoever that the gang found at all throughout the second story of the comic book. I found there to be no atmosphere in the second story as well. I felt no tension or suspense or creepiness or eeriness from either the main villain of the story or the setting. Wasn't fearing for the gang's safety. Wasn't on the edge of my seat wondering what was going to happen next. Didn't find anything creepy or eerie about the villain or the setting. Completely devoid of any sort of atmosphere. Like the first story, I just didn't feel like the visuals really provided any sort of atmosphere. It was really devoid of it. It just wasn't really that prevalent or much of a focus throughout the second story. And my final negative is I found the setting of the second story to be bland as well. So the main setting of the second story is the retired spook house operator's home, and his home just kind of felt like any other normal home. It didn't really feel that different. Didn't have any cool set pieces, wasn't really that unique or interesting. It was just kind of like a bland, boring setting. It really didn't have much flair or flavor to it. It really wasn't a setting that stood out in any way. It was like, okay, it's just like a normal run-of-the-mill house setting. Not really much there. Not really anything to make it stand out or have any layers to it. Overall, guys, I would personally not recommend this comic book to fans and newcomers to the Scooby Doo franchise. To me, the second story in the comic book, the original story, sucks. And the adaptation of Go Away Ghost Ship, while being decent, I still think the episode is more preferable, the preferable version of the story, and is a more preferable option than this comic book adaptation. I think it's a decent adaptation, and it's certainly the best adaptation of any Scooby-Doo Wario episode. But as it stands, it's not enough for me to consider this a worthy comic book to go seek out. The only way I would recommend this comic book is if either you're a diehard Scooby-Doo fan who wants to add to your Scooby-Doo book collection and you want to, collect all things Scooby-Doo and want to, basically create a book collection of Scooby-Doo from his book history from beginning to end, or if you are a big fan of Go Away Ghost Ship and love that episode and, want to see a comic book version of that story, that's the only reason I could really see anybody wanting to go after this, because unless you're a diehard fan who loves all things Scooby-Doo, wants to create a collection of all things Scooby-Doo, and wants everything Scooby-Doo at the palm of your hands, or is just a big fan of this particular episode of Scooby-Doo Where Are You and wants to see a comic book version of the story, then otherwise I would steer clear from it. It's not really worth seeking out. The original story isn't that great, and while the comic book adaptation is decent, I don't think it's enough to really warrant a recommendation for me personally. Anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed the review. Please give a like if you did. Comment down below your thoughts on the comic book. Do you like this comic book? Do you think this is a really good Scooby-Doo comic book and there's more positives that you see that I don't see? Do you hate this comic book? I'd be interested in that as well. Do you think that's there's more flaws and negatives that you see that I don't see, and maybe there's more negatives that, are prevalent throughout either one or both stories, and it's a comic book not worthy seeking out? Or are you somewhere in the middle where you think it's average and decent and okay, but it's neither good nor bad? I'm curious for your thoughts, let me know. And subscribe for more Scooby-Doo content like this, or if you're just interested in my other content, obviously I have more Scooby-Doo reviews on the way. This is a Scooby-focused channel, so we cover all things ranging from the TV shows, movies, video games, and books. You guys know the drill. I'm a diehard Scooby-Doo fan. I love talking all things Scooby-Doo. So if you're a diehard fan like me, or just a casual, or a newcomer, and you love talking all things Scooby-Doo and want to join in on each individual discussion, for each individual TV show episode review, movie review, video game Let's Player review, or book review, then come join the channel and experience some amazing Scooby-Doo content. In my next video, I will continue my Scooby-Doo book review series with a review of issue number 7 of the Scooby-Doo Wario Gold Key comic series, titled Somebody's Mummy. Now, this is actually the first comic book of the mainline series that just has one story in it. I'm not going to be reviewing two stories in one comic book. This is just one singular story in one comic book. And honestly, I like that more because it makes it easier. I can just focus on one story rather than two. And it'll probably make things a lot more easier for me as I could just focus in on one story rather than two stories at the same time. But yeah, it is one singular story, and it is an adaptation of Scooby-Doo and a Mummy 2, which is Season 1, Episode 12 of Scooby-Doo Wario. I think I gave that episode either a decent or below average rating. I don't remember. It's been a while since I reviewed that episode, but I don't remember what my exact rating was. But I'm not going in with too high expectations because most of the adaptations of Scooby-Doo Wario episodes have ranged from bad to decent. So I'm expecting somewhere around that region. It's probably not going to be like a good or great, enhancement over the original story. It will probably be on par or worse than the original story, most likely. But yeah, if you want to know my thoughts on issue number 7 of the Scooby-Doo Wario Gold Key comic series, Somebody's Mummy, then come join me next time. Anyways, thank you guys so much for watching this video, and as always, peace out.